Alongside the Trump administration, a new Congress has also taken power in Washington, D.C. The 119th Congress brings unified Republican control of both chambers, with key votes, such as confirming many of President Trump's cabinet nominees complete. Another focus will be on congressional investigations and oversight. What might the oversight landscape look like? What investigative priorities will take center stage? And what role will key actors, both inside and outside of Congress, play in shaping policy and accountability over the next year? This is the Just Security Podcast. I'm your host, Paresh Shah. Joining the show to discuss what we can expect when it comes to congressional investigations is Ronak Desai. Ronak is the firm-wide leader of the Congressional Investigations practice at Paul Hastings, where he advises clients facing high-stakes oversight inquiries and regulatory scrutiny. Ronak previously served on Capitol Hill in multiple roles, including recently on a prominent select committee, with members including Adam Schiff, Adam Smith, Jim Jordan, and Mike Pompeo. In private practice, Ronak has handled a number of high-profile congressional investigations on behalf of clients on Capitol Hill, both behind closed doors and publicly in the glare of the media spotlight. Ronak, thanks so much for joining the show. There's a new Congress in Washington, so could you start by giving us a sense of the landscape?
Absolutely, Paris, and thank you so much for having me on. The landscape currently governing Congress is an interesting one. You have, as you mentioned, trifecta control insofar as the GOP controls the White House, as well as the Senate and the lower chamber of the House. And in theory, what that means is that the Republican Party should be able to move their legislative and oversight agendas incredibly swiftly. A few things, though, to highlight that complicates the picture slightly. First and foremost is that Speaker Johnson's majority in the House is razor thin. I think it's 2 seats currently. Once Representative Stefanik is confirmed to become the UN ambassador, it'll be down to 1 seat. And what this means is that the Speaker needs to now navigate a pretty volatile and oftentimes unstable coalition of establishment conservatives, folks in the Freedom Caucus, others that are closely aligned with President Trump, as well as those that are moderate and even swing district Republicans. What this means is that House leadership has very little room for error. Any internal division could stall the legislative agenda. It could derail investigative priorities. By contrast, the Senate GOP, much more stable, much more of a comfortable margin, allowing them, as we've seen, to very expeditiously push through nominations, conduct oversight, and shape policy with more consistency. I think that's the first feature of the current landscape. The second one, of course, is Congress is moving very swiftly and very aggressively to enact the Trump agenda. We see here that the president came out of the gate very, very quickly and immediately after his inauguration, making very clear and enumerating very decisively what his priorities were, what his agenda would be, and his expectation that really his Republican Congress would fall in line, reminding them that, he was able to flip control of the House and increase the GOP Senate majority really on the coattails of his electoral performance in the presidential. And his vision of governance, of investigations, and where he's going to be focused is something that he very much expects both the House and the Senate to not just actively support, but to very aggressively advance as well. And we're seeing that, I think, manifest in a constellation of different ways just in the very few months since he's taken over the White House and that the GOP's taken over the House of Representatives. Third, and I think lastly, and connected to that, is this idea that Congress, yes, its Article 1 status as a co-equal branch of the government, an important player in the balance of checks and balances that we enjoy in this country, seems to be very willing to cede much of its Article 1 authority to the president. And this is something that I think is a relatively new phenomenon. We've seen this before, this ongoing calibration of power between the executive and legislative branches. We saw this during the George W. Bush administration, of course. Each president and each presidency tries to self-aggrandize power. But I think what we're witnessing right now under this second Trump administration is unprecedented. At the speed at which that recalibration is taking place and the willingness with which this current Congress is allowing essentially its authority and powers to be usurped by the executive branch. And what that means, of course, for legislation and really for congressional investigations and oversight, which is where I focus, is yet to be seen. But we have some early indications of what's going to unfold over the next several months in this new Congress that was just impaneled a few weeks ago.
Yeah, thanks so much for that overview. That's really helpful. And with that razor thin majority in the House and a bit more cushion in the Senate, as you note, where are some of those priorities thematically where we might see congressional investigations and committees becoming active?
Yeah, I think, look, we have a pretty good indication of where things are based on some of the early investigations and hearings that have already been unveiled. And I think we have some good telltale signs of where things are going. Weaponization of government, right? If we look at the key themes that President Trump campaigned on during the election, we're seeing that really translate into oversight and investigation priorities in this Congress. Weaponization of government is one of those key themes, and it's an area now that you're seeing various committees of jurisdiction adopt in different capacities and begin conducting investigations on. I think related to that, of course, is what we call look-back investigations into previous administrations. Structurally speaking, when you have Congress and the White House belonging to the same political party, there tends to be this dynamic where Congress is going to be less inclined to investigate its own president. And as a result, it turns its attention to the previous administration and these so-called look-back investigations across a whole host of different committees, whether it's in foreign policy, national security, economic policy. Some of the key decisions and rulings made by the Biden administration has become predictably a centerpiece of the current congressional efforts at scrutiny in that capacity. I think another area, of course, is on DEI, ESG. This is something that Republicans flagged very early on as being priorities for oversight and priorities for investigation. We're seeing that materialize in a whole host of different contexts and capacities. This scrutiny of DEI and ESG in the federal context. We're seeing it take place in the university and higher education context, and we're seeing it also take place generally in the private sector. I think the private sector will continue to be a huge focus of congressional efforts as well. Which industries in particular, I think, again, we're still starting to see that story be told a little bit. We're not seeing some of the industries we would expect to be seeing fall into the crosshairs. And I think the opposite is also true. So in some instances, big tech, certain financial institutions, again, some of these areas are where we're seeing a lot of congressional scrutiny be focused just in the last few weeks. Another priority that I think is worth highlighting for this current Congress is going to be what I believe is the renewed focus on institutions of higher learning, universities, colleges, just educational institutions across the board. We started seeing some of this in the last Congress, Horace, with the disastrous congressional hearings featuring the presidents of Harvard and Penn. I believe that was in front of the House Committee on Education and Workforce. And those hearings and the poor performance by two of the three of the witnesses there led to those respective university presidents being fired. And what's happened since then is you see the Trump administration issue, just scores of different executive orders directed at universities, whether they're focused on DEI, whether they're focused on combating anti-Semitism, a whole host of different, issue areas that are going to impact universities in so many different capacities, right? In terms of protest activity, free speech issues, compliance with immigration authorities. It's really intended to put universities on notice that they're now operating under a new degree of scrutiny and a new degree of expectations that are intended to align with the Trump administration's priorities. I think this Congress in particular is going to continue that push, and we're going to see a lot more activity in the university context, whether it is on anti-Semitism, college athletics, compliance with other governing rules and regulations over the coming months. And universities are going to have to really, I think, examine, review their own mechanisms, their compliance apparatuses, their engagement with the federal government, their priorities and their values, to really see how this all plays out to make sure that they stay as safe as possible.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And let's hone in a little bit more on the China Select Committee. What are you seeing there, and especially in terms of how Congress might be involved with foreign policy, foreign affairs, especially as we see the president taking broad measures on tariffs and economic policy?
Absolutely. The China Select Committee has really emerged as the rare bipartisan, committee in the Congress at a time, I think, that partisanship and hyperpolarization are reigning supreme. The China Select Committee, which was authorized under the last Congress and reauthorized under this Congress, continues to be in a lot of ways an outlier. And it really reflects, Paris, the bipartisan consensus that governs Washington about the strategic competition against China in which the United States finds itself in. And now Rep. Molinar and Ranking Member Raja Krishnamurthy from Illinois, great working relationship. They've got heavyweights on both sides of the aisle working on that committee. It's really emerged as, again, this flagship, iconic apparatus within the corridors of Congress, and they're looking at literally everything. It was this committee that really put into sharp focus the threat that TikTok poses to the United States. And it was the work that committee did in the last Congress, for example, which directly resulted in the TikTok ban. This Congress looking forward, I think, as we're now starting to see a number of different issues materialize in connection with the US-China strategic competition, my sense, just based on what we've seen so far, is that there's going to be a focus, for example, on export controls. I think the Select Committee is going to be really examining, compliance with export controls. They're going to be looking also at, again, outbound investments into China by some of the most iconic names that one can think of. They'll be looking at human rights, the forced labor and the legislation that's been passed in connection with the Xinjiang province and of course the persecuted Uyghur minority. They're looking at more broadly trade and geoeconomics with China and to see in what capacity can the United States continue to preserve its position and advance American interests in that regard. So that's one of the committees to be paying close attention to. They're going to be looking at a number of different issues. And given where we are right now and what's developing on the world stage, as we have this ubiquitous competition with China ongoing, this committee is going to be a center of a lot of the really, I think, far-reaching and important action. You mentioned President Trump, and again, this recalibration of power that's ongoing between Congress and the executive branch. The TikTok example that I just referenced a minute ago, I think is a good case study. And I think it's instructive. The Select Committee and a host of other committees on Capitol Hill shine the spotlight on TikTok, Paris, in terms of the threat it faces, essentially forcing the company to divest its Chinese ownership. As you are well aware, and as Just Security has very effectively covered, that process went through a whole constellation of judicial review and the DC Circuit, and then also the Supreme Court looking at this question, whether or not Congress acted in its power. And this is an area where one would normally say, look, Congress has a role to play in foreign policy, Congress has a role to play in national security, and it's doing so in this regard. And yet what ends up happening is Trump comes in and essentially gives TikTok a stay of execution, right? And says, hey, you know what? I'm going to see if we can make a deal here and keep TikTok on for the millions of American users that have the app on their phones. And it's emblematic, I think, of the ongoing dynamic between these branches and some of both the challenges and opportunities that we're going to continue to see materialize as these two branches of government work with each other over the next several months.
Right. It's a good point you bring up. The separation of powers issue really is so salient. And I wonder if there are areas where you actually think that there might be, if not wholesale oversight of the executive branch, maybe pockets of it. Are you seeing anything on that front? Are there places where Congress is actually being assertive at all in its oversight powers when it comes to the executive branch?
I mean, look, I think it's to be seen, right? I mean, the idea that Congress will expressly and utterly abdicate its oversight responsibilities, I think, is unlikely. I just hosted something uh, with two very senior and well-known congressional investigators at my firm where we talked about this idea. And what they told me is, look, there's a lot of stuff that's happening even behind the scenes in terms of oversight by Congress of the executive branch. And look, with Doge now, with the Elon Musk factor, as I call it, where you have this individual and this brand new agency, this executive branch agency, or whatever status it currently enjoys, making its way through the federal government, that there might be a good chance of what I call some organic oversight and investigation of that and of that dynamic going forward.
And along with the China Select Committee being reauthorized, are there other committees that you're also keeping an eye on?
Yeah, look, in addition to the permanent standing committees of jurisdiction, oversight, foreign affairs, armed services, energy and commerce, transportation, I mean, there's activity and important developments taking place in each one of these. Another area in the congressional landscape that I'm also paying attention to is some of the new committees that the new Congress has authorized just in the past few weeks. Let me give you a few examples. So, number one, there was a January 6th committee, right, in the last Congress, and they were entrusted and tasked with investigating the January 6th, 2021 insurrection against the Capitol. It was bipartisan. Liz Cheney, Adam Kinzinger, as long as a host of others from the other side of the aisle. That committee terminated with the last Congress, and what we saw this time around is that Speaker Johnson has announced that there's going to be a new January 6th committee to investigate the old January 6th committee to see how that first January 6th committee was, weaponized and weaponizing. And that's an area that I think is going to be of interest to a number of different stakeholders inside and outside of Capitol Hill, especially as they begin making appointments to that special committee. So the second one that I'll also be paying attention to, and that I believe is going to be of interest, is a brand new task force on declassification and transparency that Chairman Jim Comer of the Oversight Committee announced just a few weeks ago as well. This is, I believe, called the Task Force on the Declassification of Federal Secrets. And their mission is to examine the declassification materials in the public interest of the assassinations of former President John F. Kennedy, Senator Robert Kennedy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And these are assassinations that I believe continue to be of interest to the American public and capture a big part of the American imagination. And the fact that they have indeed empaneled a new task force focused exclusively on these subjects, I think is also revealing. Consistent, of course, Paris, with President Trump's pledges of transparency, and another instance in which Congress is really working very expeditiously to enact the president's agenda going forward. Look, the other thing that I'll be paying attention to is the new Doge subcommittee that's being chaired by Marjorie Taylor Greene. And this is a subcommittee that's part of the House Judiciary Committee, chaired by Jim Jordan, who's one of the most, if not the most effective questioners in the U.S. Congress. And again, the role Doge is playing right now and the impact it has already had on the entire federal government and the federal workforce, and the role that Congress will play in conducting oversight over that, I think the jury is still out, but should be an incredibly fascinating, again, case study of the relationship between the federal and executive branches and their respective roles, especially as we're still understanding the ramifications of what Elon Musk and his crew are doing.
Yeah, quite a lot to track there, and definitely a lot to look at in terms of what Doge is doing. There are also some demographic shifts in Congress. Members are getting younger. Are you seeing any particular trends in that direction in terms of who's actually in the room in terms of members who are making these decisions?
Yeah, look, I think one of the great things about Capitol Hill, having served there myself, going back to when I was, in college, is that Capitol Hill is the place that isn't governed by hierarchy insofar as, if you're a young, competent person, you really can't help run the government. And what we've seen just in the last few years is that the members themselves are getting younger. Overall, there's been a generational shift, right? And absolutely, there's some of the members that have been there for decades and decades, but they're starting to see a change here. And with that younger generation of members has been a corresponding generation of younger staffers and congressional investigators. Their outlook is going to be different. Their priorities are going to be different. Their agenda is going to be different. I see this every day. And there's going to be changes in terms of what they focus on. There are going to be changes in terms of how they conduct those investigations. There are going to be changes on what they're focused is going to be, not just in this Congress, but in the next Congress.
And let's turn to the role that Democrats can play in the minority. What can they do there?
Being in the minority on Capitol Hill is tough. I think right now, Democrats on the Hill are still in the process of formulating and implementing a pathway forward. But long story short, there is a role for Democrats to play. They're going to be focused on naming and shaming, right? There's certain Democrats, irrespective of whether they're in the minority or the majority, have been very effective at bringing attention to certain issues. And that's really what Congress does. Congress's, primary article and function, in addition to legislating, is to bring attention to topics and to issues that it cares about. And right now, I think that's the key role Democrats are endeavoring to play. Now, there's exceptions to the rule. I mean, ultimately, the China Select Committee, which we've talked about, operates, predominantly in a bipartisan fashion. That's been true traditionally of the Armed Services Committee, of the House Foreign Affairs Committee in the last Congress under Chairman, McFaul, with some exceptions. So it's not as if Democrats will be completely excluded. But when it comes to the president's agenda, when it comes to slowing down or even stopping some of what the president is prioritizing and has already begun to do, both directly through executive action, but also through, his allies on Capitol Hill, midterm elections, at least in the House for Democrats, cannot come soon enough.
And you've mentioned muscular congressional oversight across a variety of industries in the private sector and for other individuals. In practical terms, what should someone do if they're in Congress's crosshairs for an investigation, other than hiring top tier talent to represent them?
There's a whole question of what are best practices, and I'll answer that question in terms of mistakes that we see and mistakes that congressional investigators themselves, have talked about in the past. If you find yourself the subject or the target of a congressional investigation, one of the biggest mistakes one can make is to do nothing, right? What we have found in our experience, both when I was on the Hill and now in the private sector representing clients, is that there's a general lack, Paris, of familiarity with the way Congress operates and what it means to be the subject or a target of a congressional investigation. Even the most sophisticated companies who are used to dealing with the Department of Justice or dealing with the SEC or dealing with state level regulators or enforcement authorities don't realize that Congress operates totally differently, right? It's not purely a legal proceeding. It is a political proceeding with reputational stakes and equities that implicate the media, that implicate your business operations. It's a whole constellation of different interests that one has to be mindful of. And one of the biggest mistakes we see is that folks receive a letter or get outreach from Congress, and it's either to be paralyzed and not do anything and say, if I do nothing, it'll go away, or to not take it seriously enough. And because they're used to dealing with, again, these other agencies, they try to then pursue a similar course of action, and that doesn't work. You mentioned, hiring top tier talent, and I appreciate that. One caveat I'll add on to that, though, is this idea that the congressional investigations landscape is different. Folks assume that because they've successfully represented clients in front of the Department of Justice or in front of the SEC, that they're able to do so in front of Congress. And one thing that I used to see when I served as counsel on the Hill is you could tell which lawyers in private practice had congressional investigations defense experience and which didn't, and what the differences are between the different contexts in which that enforcement is taking place. So ultimately, if you see that you are in the crosshairs, hire the right people, respond, be prepared, and realize that this isn't purely or exclusively a legal proceeding. Know that this is part political. There's consequences that are reputational, consequences for the larger industry, that there's essentially political theater going on here. And consult with the right folks. And that's ultimately what's going to help navigate the very treacherous terrain that is congressional investigations, especially given some of the uncertainty that's compounding the landscape right now, given the transition period in which, we find ourselves in at present.
Some very practical tips there. Is there anything that we haven't touched on yet that you'd like to add?
Look, I think ultimately, Paris, the next few months up through the midterms are going to be unprecedented and fascinating. There's a lot that is still unfolding in real time. Things change not just day by day, but hour by hour. As we're seeing all these different developments, both here domestically and also on the world stage, Congress does have a role to play. Congress will continue to be an important seat of a lot of this activity, both domestically and internationally going forward. But all of us that follow these issues very closely, that work in congressional investigations, are really navigating a period that we haven't really seen before, just given all the different variables that are at play. Some features will remain intact in terms of this landscape, but it's really going to be, I think, a fascinating time to see, again, how this all ultimately unfolds and plays out.
Yeah, fascinating times indeed. Ronak, thanks so much for joining the show and for sharing your expertise and helping us to unpack what to expect in this next cycle of congressional investigations. Thanks again.
Thank you, Paris.
Hey, it's Paris. Before we get to the credits, I have a quick announcement. For the past 2.5 years, it's been my honor to host the Just Security podcast and to help you, our listeners, navigate the world of national security, democracy, rights, and the rule of law. I've cherished every episode. Our guests have taught and inspired me, and I hope they've done the same for you. But now I'm moving on to a new opportunity. It takes a village to produce a podcast, and to everyone who has helped to make this show so special, thank you. We couldn't have done it without you. Of course, the podcast will continue, and in the coming episodes, you'll hear many familiar voices from members of the Just Security team. And with that, this episode was produced by me, Paras Shah, with help from Clara Apt. Special thanks to Ronak Desai. You can read all of Just Security's coverage of Congress and the Trump administration on our website. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.